It was a quiet Tuesday morning in the heart of Brooklyn, and the smell of freshly baked bread wafted through the air. Adanna Okonkwo stood behind the counter of her small but bustling restaurant, Mama Adanna's Kitchen. The place was alive with the clatter of plates, the hum of conversation, and the occasional burst of laughter from her regulars. Adanna had built this restaurant from the ground up, pouring her heart and soul into every dish. It wasn't just a business, it was her home, her dream, and her way of providing for her two children, If and Chidi. Adanna had come to the United States 15 years ago, leaving behind her life in Nigeria with nothing but a suitcase and a dream. She wanted a better future for her children, and she worked tirelessly to make it happen. Over the years, her restaurant became a cornerstone of the community. People came not just for the food, but for the warmth and love that Adanna poured into every meal. She was known for her jollof rice, her egusi soup, and her infectious smile that could brighten even the darkest day. But that morning, as Adanna wiped down the counter and greeted her customers, she noticed a man in a dark suit standing by the door. He looked out of place, holding a folder in his hands and scanning the room as if searching for someone. Adanna's heart sank when their eyes met. She knew deep down that this wasn't a customer. The man approached her with a polite but firm expression. "Mrs. Okonkwo?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. He handed her the folder. "This is for you." Adanna opened the folder, her eyes scanning the words on the page. It was a deportation notice. A clerical error in her immigration paperwork from years ago had come to light, and now she was being ordered to leave the country within 30 days. Her heart pounded in her chest as the words blurred before her eyes. This couldn't be happening, not after everything she had built, not after all the sacrifices she had made. The man offered a brief, rehearsed apology before leaving, but Adanna barely heard him. She stood frozen, the weight of the notice pressing down on her like a heavy stone. Her mind raced with questions. How could this happen? What would happen to her children, to her restaurant, to the life she had worked so hard to create? That night, Adanna sat at the kitchen table with Ifa and Chidi. Ifa, her 17-year-old daughter, was the more serious and studious of the two. She had dreams of becoming a doctor and often helped her mother with the restaurant after school. Chidi, her 15-year-old son, was the joker of the family, always finding ways to make them laugh even in the toughest times. But tonight there was no laughter. Adanna explained the situation as calmly as she could, but her voice cracked with emotion. "They're saying I have to leave," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But this is our home. This is where you've grown up. I can't leave you." Ife reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "We'll fight this, Mama. We're not going to let them take you away." Chidi nodded, his usual playful demeanor replaced with a rare seriousness. "We'll figure it out. We're a team, right?" Adanna smiled through her tears, grateful for her children's strength. But deep down, she was terrified. The clock was ticking, and she didn't know where to start. The next morning, Adanna decided to confide in her closest friend, Pastor James, who had been a pillar of support for her since she first arrived in Brooklyn. Pastor James was a kind, soft-spoken man in his 60s, with a calming presence that made you feel like everything would be okay, even when it wasn't. When Adanna told him about the deportation notice, his face fell. "This is unjust," he said firmly. "You've done so much for this community. We're not going to let this happen." Pastor James wasted no time rallying the community. He organized a meeting at the church that evening, and word spread quickly. By the time Adanna arrived, the room was packed, with her loyal customers, neighbors, and friends. There was Mrs. Rodriguez, who always ordered extra plantains for her grandchildren. Mr. Patel, who came in every Sunday after church for a plate of Adanna's famous pepper soup. Even the local mailman, who had been delivering letters to Adanna's restaurant for years, was there. One by one, people stood up to share their stories about how Adanna had touched their lives. Mrs. Rodriguez talked about how Adanna had cooked meals for her family when her husband was in the hospital. Mr. Patel shared how Adanna had once stayed open late just so he could pick up dinner after a long shift. The mailman joked about how Adanna always slipped him a free pastry on cold winter mornings. By the end of the night, the room was buzzing with determination. Pastor James announced that they would start a petition, write letters of support, and raise money for legal fees. "Adanna is one of us," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "And we're not going to let her go without a fight." For the first time since receiving the notice, Adanna felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone in this battle. She had a community that loved her and believed in her. But as the days went on, she realized that love and support might not be enough. Adanna used the money raised by the community to hire an immigration lawyer, a sharp and determined woman named Rachel Kim. Rachel was known for taking on tough cases, and she assured Adanna that she would do everything in her power to help. But during their first meeting, Rachel uncovered a major problem. The missing document from Adanna's original visa application was a critical piece of evidence. Without it, their case was weak. Rachel explained that the immigration system was unforgiving when it came to paperwork errors, even if they weren't Adanna's fault. "I'm not going to lie to you," Rachel said, her tone serious. "The odds are against us, but that doesn't mean we give up. We'll fight this." Adanna nodded, trying to stay strong, but the weight of Rachel's words was crushing. She left the lawyer's office feeling more uncertain than ever. How could she fight a system that seemed determined to tear her life apart? That weekend, as Adanna and her children sorted through old papers in search of anything that might help their case, I stumbled upon something unexpected. It was a yellowed newspaper clipping from 2012 during the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. The headline read, "Local Chef Feeds Hundreds During Crisis." The article detailed how Adanna had turned her restaurant into a makeshift relief center during the hurricane. She had cooked meals for stranded families, delivered food to elderly neighbors, and even helped rescue a woman trapped in her flooded apartment. There was a photo of Adanna in the article, standing in her kitchen with a pot of steaming soup, her face tired but determined. If held up the clipping, her eyes wide. "Mama, this is it. This proves how much you've done for this community. We can use this." Adanna's heart swelled with pride as she looked at the article. She had almost forgotten about that time, so focused had she been on surviving and moving forward. But now it felt like a lifeline. Maybe this could be the key to proving her value to the community and strengthening her case. Adanna and Rachel submitted the newspaper clipping, along with testimonies from people she had helped during Hurricane Sandy, to the immigration office. But their hopes were quickly dashed. The immigration office dismissed the evidence as irrelevant to her legal status. It didn't matter how much Adanna had contributed to her community. What mattered was the missing document. Rachel was furious. "This is bureaucracy at its worst," she said. "They're ignoring the human side of this case." Adanna felt the hope she had clung to slipping away, but she refused to give up. She had come too far to let a piece of paper decide her fate. Just as Adanna was trying to regroup, another blow came from an unexpected source. A rival restaurant owner, Mr. Thompson, who had always been jealous of Adanna's success, began spreading rumors that she was operating illegally and exploiting her staff. The rumors reached the health department, and one morning, inspectors showed up unannounced. They found minor violations, nothing serious, but enough to force Adanna to temporarily close her restaurant. It was a devastating setback. Without the restaurant, Adanna had no income to pay her legal fees or support her children, and with the clock ticking, every day counted. The closure of the restaurant hit Adanna hard. For the first time in years, the kitchen was silent, the tables empty, and the lights off. The once bustling space that had been her sanctuary now felt like a hollow shell. Without the restaurant's income, Adanna's savings began to dwindle rapidly. She had to make tough choices, cutting back on groceries, skipping utility payments, and even considering selling the restaurant to fund her legal fight. Her children noticed the strain. Ife, ever the responsible one, tried to help by taking on more chores and managing the household budget. But Chidi, in his own way, wanted to do more. One evening, Adanna came home from a meeting with Rachel to find Chidi sitting at the kitchen table, looking nervous. "Mama," he began hesitantly, "I got a part-time job." Adanna froze. "What?" "Chidi, you're supposed to be focusing on school." "I know," he said quickly, "but I want to help. I can't just sit here and watch you struggle. I can work after school and on weekends. It's not a big deal." Adanna's heart ached. She knew Chidi meant well, but the thought of her son sacrificing his education for her broke her. "Chidi," she said softly, sitting down beside him, "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but your job is to study, to build a future for yourself. That's why I came here, to give you and your sister opportunities I never had." "But Mama," he started, but she cut him off gently. "No," she said firmly. "We'll find another way." Chidi nodded reluctantly, but the tension lingered. Adanna knew her children were trying to be strong for her, but the weight of their situation was taking its toll on all of them. Desperate for a breakthrough, one of Adanna's younger customers, a college student named Mia, suggested starting a social media campaign to raise awareness about her case. "People need to hear your story," Mia said passionately. "If we can get enough attention, maybe someone with influence will step in to help." Adanna was hesitant at first. She wasn't comfortable with the idea of putting her personal struggles on display for the world to see. But with time running out, she agreed. Mia created a heartfelt video featuring clips of Adanna cooking in her restaurant, testimonials from her customers, and a plea for support. The video was posted with the hashtag #SaveMamaAdanna. For a brief moment, it seemed like things might turn around. The video was shared by a few local influencers, and Adanna's regulars did their best to spread the word. But the campaign never gained the traction they had hoped for. The internet, it seemed, was too crowded with other stories, other causes, and other crises. Adanna's story was just one among many, and it didn't stand out enough to go viral. When Mia showed Adanna the campaign's lackluster results, Adanna tried to hide her disappointment. "You did your best," she said, forcing a smile. "That's all anyone can do." But deep down, she felt a growing sense of despair. It was as if the world had decided her story wasn't important enough to care about. Just when Adanna thought she had exhausted every possible avenue, a man walked into her restaurant one afternoon. The restaurant was still closed, but Adanna had been cleaning the kitchen, trying to keep herself busy. She almost didn't hear the knock on the door. When she opened it, she found an older man with a kind face standing there. He introduced himself as Robert Hayes, a retired FEMA worker. "I don't know if you remember me," he said, "but I remember you." Adanna frowned, trying to place him. "I'm sorry, I don't—" "It was during Hurricane Sandy," he said, smiling. "I was coordinating relief efforts in this area, and I remember your restaurant. You were cooking meals for people, delivering food to shelters, even helping us organize supplies. You didn't have to do any of that, but you did." Adanna's eyes widened as the memory came flooding back. "Oh my goodness," she said, her voice trembling. "I do remember you." Robert nodded. "When I heard about your situation, I knew I had to come forward. I still have records from FEMA showing that your restaurant served as an unofficial relief center during the hurricane. I can testify to that, and I can provide the records as evidence." Adanna felt a surge of hope she hadn't felt in weeks. "Thank you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you so much." Robert placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't deserve this, Adanna. You've done so much for this community. It's time someone did something for you." With Robert's testimony and the FEMA records in hand, Rachel filed a new appeal. But as they prepared for the next step, Rachel uncovered something troubling. The immigration officer handling Adanna's case, a man named Gerald Whitman, had a history of rejecting appeals from immigrants with minor paperwork errors. In fact, he had been the subject of multiple complaints over the years, accusing him of bias and misconduct. Rachel filed a formal complaint against Whitman, citing his pattern of unfair treatment. But the complaint only served to delay the case further. Whitman, it seemed, was untouchable, and the system was designed to protect people like him. Adanna felt like she was running out of time. Every delay brought her closer to the deportation date, and the stress was beginning to take a toll on her health. But Rachel refused to back down. "We're not going to let one corrupt official decide your fate," she said. "We'll keep fighting." As news of Whitman's misconduct spread, Adanna's community decided to take matters into their own hands. Pastor James organized a peaceful protest outside the immigration office, demanding justice for Adanna. Dozens of people showed up, holding signs that read, "Save Mama Adanna" and "Justice for Immigrants." They chanted, sang, and shared stories about how Adanna had touched their lives. The protest gained local media attention, and a reporter from a small news station interviewed Adanna on camera. "I just want to stay with my children," she said, her voice breaking. "This is our home. This is where we belong." The protest brought a renewed sense of hope, but it also drew criticism. Some people accused Adanna of seeking attention, while others argued that the immigration system was simply doing its job. The backlash was painful, but Adanna tried to focus on the support she was receiving. In the midst of all this chaos, Adanna received an unexpected phone call from her estranged brother, Emeka, who still lived in Nigeria. They hadn't spoken in years, not since a falling out over their father's estate. But Emeka had heard about her situation through mutual friends and decided to reach out. "Adanna," he said, his voice hesitant, "I know we haven't been on the best of terms, but I want to help." Adanna was skeptical. "How?" she asked, her tone guarded. "Our father had connections," Emeka said. "He was close friends with a prominent Nigerian diplomat who now works with the United Nations. I think he might be able to help you." Adanna was stunned. She had always known her father had been well connected, but she had never thought to use those connections for herself. "I don't know, Emeka," she said. "I don't want to involve the family in this." "Adanna," Emeka said firmly, "this is your life we're talking about. Your children's future. Let me reach out to him." After a long pause, Adanna finally agreed. A few days later, the diplomat sent a letter of support, vouching for Adanna's character and contributions. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was another piece of the puzzle. The stress of the situation finally caught up with Adanna one evening as she was cleaning the restaurant. She had been feeling lightheaded all day, but she ignored it, pushing herself to keep going. Suddenly, her vision blurred and she collapsed to the floor. When she woke up, she was in a hospital bed with Ife and Chidi sitting by her side. Ife was holding her hand, tears streaming down her face. "Mama, you scared us," she said. "You have to take care of yourself." The doctor explained that Adanna's collapse was due to exhaustion and stress. "You need to rest," he said firmly. "Your body can't handle this much pressure." Adanna nodded weakly, but she couldn't stop thinking about the fight ahead. Ife and Chidi promised to take over the restaurant temporarily, determined to keep their mother's dream alive. Watching her children step up filled Adanna with both pride and guilt. She had always wanted to protect them, but now they were the ones protecting her. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Adanna lay on the bed, her face pale and her body weak. She had always been the strong one, the one who carried the weight of the world on her shoulders without complaint. But now, as she looked at her children sitting by her bedside, she realized just how much the stress had taken its toll on her. Ife sat closest to her, holding her hand tightly. Her daughter's eyes were red and puffy, and Adanna could see the worry etched into her face. Chidi sat in the corner, his usual playful demeanor replaced with a somber silence. He stared at the floor, his hands clenched into fists. "Mama," Eve said softly, her voice trembling. "You can't keep doing this to yourself. You're always taking care of everyone else, but you never let anyone take care of you." Adanna tried to smile, but it came out weak and forced. "I'm fine, my dear. I just need a little rest." "No, Mama," Chidi said suddenly, his voice louder than he intended. He stood up and walked over to the bed, his eyes blazing with emotion. "You're not fine. You've been pushing yourself too hard, and now look what's happened. You collapsed, Mama. You could have—" His voice broke, and he turned away, unable to finish the sentence. Adanna's heart ached as she watched her son struggle to hold back tears. She had always tried to shield her children from the harsh realities of life, but now they were seeing it all: the fear, the uncertainty, the exhaustion. She reached out and placed a hand on Chidi's arm, pulling him closer. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted you to see me like this. I didn't want to give up. Not on this fight, not on you." Chidi knelt beside the bed, his head resting on her arm. "We're not asking you to give up, Mama. We just want you to take care of yourself. We'll fight this together, but you can't do it alone." The doctor entered the room a few moments later, his expression serious but kind. "Mrs. Okonkwo," he said, glancing at her chart. "You've been under an incredible amount of stress, and your body is telling you it's had enough. You need to rest, real rest. If you keep pushing yourself like this, you're going to end up back here, or worse." Adanna nodded, though the thought of slowing down felt impossible. How could she rest when there was so much at stake? But as she looked at her children, she realized she didn't have a choice. If she wanted to keep fighting, she needed to take care of herself first. Over the next few days, Ife and Chidi took over the restaurant. They weren't experienced chefs, but they knew enough to keep things running. Ife handled the cooking, relying on her mother's recipes and guidance, while Chidi managed the front of the house, greeting customers and taking orders. The community rallied around them, offering to help wherever they could. Mrs. Rodriguez brought over groceries, Mr. Patel volunteered to wash dishes, and Pastor James organized a schedule of volunteers to keep the restaurant afloat. Adanna watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. Her children were stepping up in ways she had never imagined, and her community was proving once again that they had her back. But even as she rested, the looming threat of deportation hung over her like a dark cloud. Time was running out, and she knew the fight was far from over. One evening, as Ife and Chidi were cleaning the restaurant after closing, Chidi stumbled upon a box of old papers tucked away in a corner of the storage room. It was covered in dust, and the edges of the box were frayed, as if it hadn't been touched in years. "Hey, Ife!" Chidi called out, dragging the box into the kitchen. "Look what I found!" Ife wiped her hands on a towel and walked over, peering into the box. It was filled with receipts, invoices, and other documents from the early days of the restaurant. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "In the back," Chidi said, pulling out a stack of papers. "I think it's from when Mama first opened the restaurant." They began sifting through the papers, hoping to find something useful. Most of it was mundane, old supply orders, tax forms, and handwritten notes. But then, buried at the bottom of the box, Ife found something that made her heart skip a beat. It was a faded receipt from a government office dated over a decade ago. The receipt was for the submission of a document, one that matched the description of the missing paperwork in Adanna's immigration case. Ife's hands trembled as she held the receipt, her mind racing. "Chidi," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. This could be it. This could prove that Mama submitted the document years ago." Chidi leaned over to look at the receipt, his eyes widening. "Do you think this will help?" "It has to," Ife said, her voice filled with determination. "We need to show this to Rachel right away." The next morning, they brought the receipt to Rachel, who examined it carefully. "This is exactly what we needed," she said, a hint of excitement in her voice. "If we can verify this receipt, it could prove that the missing document wasn't your mother's fault. It was the government's mistake." Adanna felt a surge of hope, but she also knew better than to get her hopes up too high. The system had let her down before, and she couldn't afford to be disappointed again. Still, the receipt felt like a lifeline, a small but significant piece of evidence that could turn the tide in her favor. Rachel wasted no time submitting the receipt as new evidence in Adanna's case. But as she dug deeper into immigration law, she discovered something else, something that could change everything. There was a little-known rule that granted leniency to individuals who had made significant contributions during national emergencies. It was rarely used and often overlooked, but Rachel believed it could apply to Adanna's situation. Between the FEMA records, the testimonies from the community, and this receipt, we have a strong case, Rachel explained during their next meeting. "If we can argue that your contributions during Hurricane Sandy qualify under this rule, we might have a chance." Adanna listened intently, her heart pounding. "Do you really think it will work?" she asked. "It's a long shot," Rachel admitted. "But it's worth trying. The judge will have to consider all the evidence, and this rule could tip the scales in our favor." The new appeal was filed, and the waiting game began once again. Adanna tried to stay busy, helping Ife and Chidi at the restaurant when she could, and leaning on her community for support. But the uncertainty was agonizing. Every day felt like a battle against time, and the weight of the unknown pressed down on her like a heavy burden. As the days turned into weeks, Adanna's story began to gain more attention. A local journalist named Sarah Bennett, who had once interviewed Adanna during Hurricane Sandy, heard about her case and decided to write a feature story. Sarah had always admired Adanna's resilience and generosity, and she believed the world needed to hear her story. The article, titled "A Mother's Fight, The Woman Who Fed a Community Now Faces Deportation," was published in the local newspaper and quickly gained traction. It detailed Adanna's journey, her contributions during Hurricane Sandy, and the challenges she faced as a single mother and immigrant. The story was raw, emotional, and deeply personal, and it struck a chord with readers. People began sharing the article on social media, and soon Adanna's story was being discussed far beyond Brooklyn. Local news stations picked up the story, and Adanna was invited to speak on a morning talk show. She was nervous at first, but Rachel encouraged her to use the opportunity to share her truth. During the interview, Adanna spoke from the heart. "I came to this country with nothing but a dream," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've worked hard to build a life for my children, to give them opportunities I never had. This community has become my family, and I've done everything I can to give back. All I want is the chance to stay and continue building the life we've started here." The interview resonated with viewers, and the hashtag number #SaveMamaAdanna began trending on social media. For the first time, it felt like the tide was turning. But even as the support poured in, Adanna knew the final decision would come down to the immigration court. The media attention caught the eye of a city council member named Marcus Reed, who had been a regular at Adanna's restaurant for years. Marcus was known for his advocacy work and his commitment to supporting immigrant communities. When he read about Adanna's case, he felt compelled to act. Marcus reached out to Rachel and offered his support. "Adanna has been a pillar of this community," he said during their meeting. "I've seen firsthand how much she's done for the people here. I'll do whatever I can to help." He wrote a letter to the immigration office, vouching for Adanna's character and contributions. He also contacted a state senator, urging them to get involved. The process was slow, but Marcus's involvement added another layer of credibility to Adanna's case. Adanna was deeply moved by Marcus's support. "I never expected someone like him to fight for me," she said to Rachel. "It gives me hope." But even with the growing support, the outcome remained uncertain. The system was unpredictable, and Adanna knew better than to count on anything until the final decision was made. Then, just when it seemed like things were finally moving in the right direction, Adanna received the news she had been dreading. Her appeal was officially denied, and she was given a final deportation date. The letter arrived on a rainy afternoon, and as Adanna read the words, her hands began to shake. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This can't be happening." Ife and Chidi were home when she broke the news. Ife immediately burst into tears, while Chidi sat in stunned silence, his face pale. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice trembling. Adanna didn't have an answer. For the first time, she felt truly defeated. She had fought so hard, leaned on her community, and done everything in her power to stay. But it hadn't been enough. That night, Adanna sat alone in the restaurant, staring at the empty tables. The memories of the past 15 years flooded her mind, the laughter, the celebrations, the countless meals shared with friends and strangers alike. This place wasn't just a restaurant, it was her life, her legacy. And now it was slipping away. But even in the depths of her despair, a small voice inside her refused to give up. This wasn't over, not yet. There had to be a way to fight back, to keep her family together. She just had to find it. The days following the rejection was some of the darkest Adanna had ever faced. The final deportation date loomed over her like a storm cloud, and no matter how hard she tried to stay strong for her children, the weight of it all was crushing. She spent her nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how she would say goodbye to the life she had built, to the community that had become her family, and, most painfully, to her children. But fate, it seemed, wasn't done with her yet. It was a quiet evening when Chidi, who had been cleaning the restaurant after closing, came running into the living room, clutching a piece of paper in his hand. His face was flushed, and his breath came in short gasps. "Mama, Mama, look at this!" he shouted, waving the paper in the air. Adanna, startled, sat up from the couch where she had been resting. "Chidi, what is it?" she asked, her voice tinged with both concern and curiosity. Chidi handed her the paper, his hands trembling with excitement. It was the receipt they had found weeks ago, the one proving that Adanna had submitted the missing document years ago. But this time, Chidi had noticed something they hadn't seen before. At the bottom of the receipt, in faint, almost illegible handwriting, was a note from the government office acknowledging the submission of the document. It was dated and signed by an official. Adanna's heart skipped a beat as she read the note. This proves it," she whispered, her voice shaking. "This proves that the missing document wasn't my fault. It was their mistake." Ife, who had been listening from the kitchen, rushed over to see the receipt. "Mama, we have to show this to Rachel right away," she said, her voice filled with urgency. The next morning, Adanna and her children met with Rachel, who examined the receipt with a mixture of disbelief and excitement. "This is it," Rachel said, her voice firm. "This is the evidence we've been waiting for. If we can get this verified, it could reopen your case." Rachel wasted no time submitting the receipt to the immigration office, along with a formal request to reopen Adanna's case. The process was agonizingly slow, and the final deportation date was just days away. But then, on the eve of her scheduled deportation, Rachel received a call. Adanna was sitting in the restaurant, staring at the empty tables, when Rachel burst through the door, her face lit up with excitement. "Adanna," she said, barely able to contain herself. "They've verified the receipt. Your case has been reopened, and you've been granted a temporary stay while they review the new evidence." Adanna felt her knees go weak as the words sank in. "Does this mean—" she began, but Rachel held up a hand. "It means we have a chance," Rachel said. "It's not over yet, but this is a huge step forward." For the first time in weeks, Adanna allowed herself to hope. The fight wasn't over, but she was still in it. The day of the final hearing arrived, and Adanna walked into the courtroom with her head held high. She was surrounded by her children, her lawyer, and a small group of supporters from the community, including Pastor James, Mrs. Rodriguez, and even Robert Hayes, the retired FEMA worker who had come forward to testify on her behalf. The judge, a stern-looking woman with sharp eyes, listened intently as Rachel presented the evidence. She began with the receipt, which proved that the missing document had been submitted years ago and that the error was on the government's part, not Adanna's. Then she introduced the FEMA records, which showed that Adanna's restaurant had served as an unofficial relief center during Hurricane Sandy. Robert Hayes testified about Adanna's contributions during the disaster, describing how she had cooked meals for stranded families, delivered food to elderly neighbors, and even helped coordinate relief efforts. Next came the testimonies from the community. Mrs. Rodriguez spoke about how Adanna had supported her family during her husband's illness. Mr. Patel described how Adanna's restaurant had become a safe haven for people in the neighborhood. Even Marcus Reed, the city council member, submitted a letter of support, vouching for Adanna's character and contributions. Finally, Rachel invoked the little-known immigration rule that granted leniency to individuals who had made significant contributions during national emergencies. "Your Honor," Rachel said, her voice steady and confident, "Adanna Okonkwo is not just an immigrant. She is a mother, a business owner, and a pillar of her community. She has given so much to this country, and it would be a grave injustice to tear her away from the life she has built here." The judge sat in silence for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to Adanna. "Mrs. Okonkwo," she said, her voice firm but not unkind, "is there anything you would like to say before I make my decision?" Adanna stood, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She took a deep breath, her voice trembling, but resolute. "Your Honor, I came to this country with nothing but a dream. I wanted to give my children a better life, and I've worked hard every day to make that dream a reality. This community has become my family, and I've done everything I can to give back to them. All I ask is for the chance to stay and continue building the life we've started here." The courtroom fell silent as the judge considered her words. Finally, she spoke. "After reviewing the evidence and hearing the testimonies, I find that Mrs. Okonkwo has made significant contributions to her community and to this country. The missing document was not her fault, and it would be unjust to penalize her for a clerical error. Therefore, I am granting Mrs. Okonkwo permanent residency." The room erupted into cheers as Adanna's supporters hugged her and congratulated her. If and Chidi clung to their mother, tears streaming down their faces. Adanna felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over her. The fight was over, and she had won. The weeks following the hearing were a whirlwind of celebration and gratitude. Adanna reopened her restaurant, and the community came out in droves to support her. The tables were always full, the kitchen bustling, and the air filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation. Adanna's story had become a symbol of hope and resilience, and people came from all over to meet the woman who had fought so hard to stay. But Adanna didn't stop there. She knew that her story was just one of many, and that there were countless others still fighting to stay in the country they called home. She began working with local advocacy groups, sharing her story and using her platform to raise awareness about the challenges immigrants faced. She spoke at rallies, attended community meetings, and even started a scholarship fund for young immigrants pursuing their dreams. Her children, too, found new strength in the experience. They've continued to excel in school, determined to become a doctor and make her mother proud. Chidi, inspired by his mother's resilience, began volunteering at a local non-profit that helped immigrant families navigate the legal system. One evening, as Adanna stood in the kitchen of her restaurant, stirring a pot of jollof rice, she looked around at the bustling dining room. Her children were laughing with customers, the air was filled with the aroma of spices, and the walls were adorned with photos and newspaper clippings that told the story of her journey. This was her home, this was her dream, and now it was hers to keep. Adanna smiled, her heart full of gratitude. She had fought for her family, for her community, and for her future. And in the end, she had won. But more than that, she had found her voice, her strength, and her place in the world. And she knew without a doubt that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have a beautiful day, and we'll see you in the next video.